My name's Gavin, this is Genre Books, and it's Tag Tuesday. The tag today is the Cozy Coffee Mug tag. This tag was originally created by Jen at Literary Loves, and I was tagged by Pat at Book Chat with Pat. There are 7 prompts and a call to tag others. This tag's a few weeks old now, so I'm going to find out who hasn't done it yet. But answer the 7 questions first. Prompt number 1, Hex the Patriarchy. Share your favourite women authors. Well, I'm going to choose an author, and I only read her first book a little over a month ago. I have her second book here, and I am excited to read it because I really enjoyed the first, and that is Muriel Jaeger. This is printed by British Library, and this is The Man with Six Senses. I read The Question Mark for Rocket Summer. The Question Mark came out in 1926, and it's a story of a future utopia stroke dystopia. It was written before Brave New World, and I think may have had some influence on Brave New World. The Question Mark was first published by the Hogarth Press, so it had some input in being selected by another favourite woman author, Virginia Woolf, and it's just a really interesting exploration of ideas. The science is a little fuzzy. There is a reason why a man from the early 20th century has been plucked out of time and finds himself in the future. But it really is more about the world that he finds rather than his getting there. Muriel Jaeger, I think there's a picture of her in this book. So yeah, here's Muriel Jaeger. She won a scholarship to Oxford University. She was one of the first women to go to Somerville College at Oxford University. She was a lifelong friend of Dorothy L. Sayers and encouraged Sayers to write her first Lord Peter Wimsey book. As well as these 2 science fiction novels, she also wrote for the theatre. One of the plays is about a gifted child, so possible science fiction influence there. There's a book that came later in the 30s called Retreat from Armageddon, which written just a few years before the Second World War. It's a bit more of a philosophical examination of basically how we've ended up in this mess. She also had editing duties on a literary magazine, and she was not a prolific but an active writer until into the 1960s. She's not well remembered now. What she is remembered for is those 2 science fiction novels. And like I say, I'm very excited to read the second because I enjoyed the first so much. It's difficult to sort of say this is my favourite woman author based on the one book, but I think the book was good enough that I want to make her case. Prompt number 2, never underestimate a woman who reads Stephen King books. Name your favourite fictional women characters. See, this is even more difficult than the authors. How do you pick? I'm going to be arbitrary and stick with just one of my favourites, but also first talk about some of the women characters in Shakespeare, because this is Shakestember. In the last week, I've read 2 Shakespeare plays which were new to me. King John, Richard II. They're very different in how they present women characters. And oddly enough, it's Richard II, which is the work that came later that has the weaker characters. I don't think any of the female characters in that play have much agency. That is not the case with King John. Whether she's a pleasant character or not, you can leave for a judgment for another time. But Eleanor of Aquitaine is a character in King John. She's King John's mother. Now, Eleanor of Aquitaine is not fictional, but this portrayal of her certainly is. In fact, the portrayal of pretty much everyone in Shakespeare's history plays is fairly fictional. But she is absolutely the power behind the throne, more so than, the Queen. So she is the former Queen, obviously. But in King John, she meets her match in Lady Constance, who is the mother of a pretender to the throne, or, a rival for the throne, possibly one with a better claim to the throne than John, and that's Arthur. And Constance and Eleanor really do sort of trade some pointed barbs in their dialogue. Characters in Shakespeare whose barbs are no less pointed, but perhaps a little more for the sake of arguing rather than the throne of a country. You have Beatrice, you have Rosalind. These are sort of great parts in plays. When Shakespeare gets women characters right, he can get them very right indeed. But my favourite, and I've spoken about this character before because I think we've had similar questions before, so I'm sticking with my answer. Becky Sharp from Vanity Fair. She's just fantastic. She is a force of nature. To be the central character of a 700, 800 page novel, and through her actions drive that narrative every step, is a pleasure to read. I haven't read that book since I was 17, 18 years old, so this is now several decades back, and it still sticks with me. I really need to reread that book, and I think I will, and I will read Vanity Fair and Bonfire of the Vanities, which was not a direct retelling, but owed more than just part of the title. So there's another little project I've given myself. Moving on. Prompt number 3, Edgar Allan Poe. Share your favourite Gothic book or story. Again, I'm dipping back way into the past here, not quite so far back as with Vanity Fair, but something I read whilst at university, and I was doing a course on American Gothic literature, and a course with that name had to include this book. It's largely seen as the first work of Gothic fiction from America, and that is Wieland by Charles Brockden Brown. I read Wieland, and I think I read Carwin or Carlin, the Biloquist, the book about the Biloquist. So that's basically ventriloquism, throwing your voice. That never hit me hard as being very Gothic or very spooky. With Wieland, the spooky power is mesmerism. Now, mesmerism was a much bigger thing back at the time when this book was written, and for some time after. It was still cropping up in the 50s with The Manchurian Candidate, which we're now calling it brainwashing. The Manchurian Candidate was remade not that long ago, 10, 15 years back. even in recent times, and this was probably a callback to the Manchurian Candidate, but the Winter Soldier in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, he is someone who is triggered by a certain set of words repeated in a certain way. This is now all for entertainment. So we have, with the Winter Soldier, it's more of a knowing nod to some previous Cold War films. Hypnotism is now seen as much more of a, sort of a theatrical entertainment now. But hypnotism and the mesmerism that preceded it and overlapped was much more scientific and much more just a cause for interest in how it occurs, and had almost supernatural elements thrown in. And it being written at the time it was, Wieland absolutely taps into that. And I think Wieland, being that first sort of Gothic work in America, is showing that Gothic is more of a state of mind than, the backdrop of castles and ruins, and a definite influence on Edgar Allan Poe, although he would never have admitted it. Prompt number 4, Swiftea. I don't know what that means, but it's what are your auto-buy authors? I'm going to give you 2, and they're people I've spoken about plenty of times on this channel previously. Jeff Dyer. So I won't say much about Jeff Dyer because I have spoken about him a lot, but he's a fantastic writer. He writes fiction, he writes reportage, he writes travel, he writes comedy. He's absolutely engaging, always interesting, and always worth buying. Another auto buy is Arthur C. Clarke. I can't get enough of Arthur C. Clarke, which is just as well because there's absolutely loads of it, and I still have stuff I need to read. Also gives me another chance to show this off, which I will continue to do at every juncture I feel fit to do so. So, battered old paperback, but to me, from Arthur C. Clarke. So that's always going to be a keeper. But yes, here's a nicer looking edition of an Arthur C. Clarke book. This is Songs of Distant Earth. This is first edition hardback, and he's just fantastic. Perhaps not always the most rounded characters, but I think they have more soul and humanity than people often give him credit for. Clarke is just absolutely rigorous. I think he's not the father of science fiction, but I think he might be the father of hard science fiction. He is someone who has to, get it correct. It doesn't limit his imagination. It actually makes things seem more real. Anyway, don't take my word, he's great. Here's some of the blurb from the back. Arthur C. Clarke is one of the true geniuses of our time. I envy him his brain. That's from Ray Bradbury. No one has done more in the way of enlightened prediction than Arthur C. Clarke. I suppose that in this respect he is the most important science fiction writer. Isaac Asimov. He has done an enormous global service in preparing the climate for serious human presence beyond the Earth. That's Carl Sagan saying that. So if you've got Bradbury, Asimov and Sagan all praising your work on the back of a book, if that's not auto-buy for a science fiction fan, I'm not sure what is. Prompt number 5, Camp Crystal Lake. Name a book that makes you feel nostalgic. Now, I don't think this is the best book I've ever read. And I don't think it's the best book I read back when I read it, but it's one that's stuck in the mind for a couple of reasons. And it gives me an association with the old library in my old town, small town, back in Wiltshire as a kid, and being allowed to get near the big boys' books. So I've moved out of the section of the library for children's literature and I've gone to the science fiction section. This is another one I am due to reread. This is Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle's Footfall. I think this is the first Niven or Pournelle, or certainly the first Niven and Pournelle that I ever read. Since then, I've read their books, The Mote in God's Eye and Lucifer's Hammer. They write really well together, but this isn't praise for this book. This one does make me feel nostalgic. I not this particular book. At the time, it was a library. It's a hard copy that I got. I remember taking not too much time to get through it, considering its length. And it's the typical story of alien invasion of Earth. It's just one of those books that got me excited for reading, excited for reading science fiction, and excited for reading sort of big old books as well. So I have nostalgic feelings about it, and I think I probably owe it a little bit of thanks. Prompt number 6. Happy Halloween. Share a holiday themed book that you recommend. I'm going to recommend some books that are from a series. I can't recommend the whole series. Well, actually, I could recommend the whole series. It's the British Library Tales of the Weird. So any of them would work for Halloween. But I'm focusing on some collections that are have a specific Yuletide feel. And I read 2 of these compilations last Christmas. I got 3 of them at the time, so I have 1 left for this Christmas, and I am looking forward to it. I think there is another compilation available now, but of the 3 I've got, I've read 2 of them, and I have 1 to go. Sunless Solstice, Chill Tidings, and Spirits of the Season. And yeah, I would heartily recommend any of these. To be honest, you could probably pick up any of the tales of the weird, and it would work at Christmas time. Reading ghost stories at Halloween is so cliche. What you want is another cliche, which is reading a ghost story at Christmas. Ghost stories at Christmas. I mean, you look at any of the Charles Dickens Christmas stories, they all have a supernatural. I think most of them, at least, have that supernatural element. Obviously, your most famous is A Christmas Carol. These stories are, more on the scary side than a Charles Dickens Christmas story. But it's not. I suppose it's not really about Christmas. It's about wintertime. It's about telling stories in the cold, in the dark. Prompt number 7. This mug contains magic. Share a book you enjoyed that is out of your comfort zone. Well, I'm going to share a book I am enjoying. That presumably counts. So I'm halfway through, just over halfway through at the moment, A Court of Thorns and Roses. Not something I would have picked, but something that a number of us are reading for a group read, and it's all the fault of the legislature of Utah State. They have banned a list of books, 13 books, half a dozen of which, so almost the half of the entire list, written by Sarah J. Maas. Given that she comprises half the list of things that have been banned for, being absolutely dangerous, detrimental to children across an entire state, it must be pretty awful. So some people have finished reading it already. Like I say, I'm halfway through. But if this offended the state legislature of Utah that much that they needed to ban it, then those people need to get out more. Let's talk about the book so far. It's not my thing, but it's well enough done. There are a couple of verbal anachronisms which wrench you from the story and don't quite sit right, but you can get over that. Am I comfortable reading it? I suppose I am. So maybe this isn't, but something that I would not have chosen. So in that respect, out of my comfort zone. But I think probably just shows that you shouldn't really have too many places where you feel uncomfortable. I can read it even if it's not for me. And if you end up reading something which really does make you feel uncomfortable, you can always stop reading it. So there's the message for Utah. Isn't choice a good thing? I also had a quick read of the legislation that banned this book or allowed this book and the others on that list to get banned. And that is taking me out of my comfort zone because it's all legalese and largely nonsense. But I did glean enough information from it to ascertain that this book, so far, 220 pages in, contravenes nothing they said they were worried about. Dismounting my high horse now for prompt number 8, which is tag other booktubers, which I will do. I'll find out who hasn't done it and I'll put some names below the line. Thanks to Jen for creating a tag. Thanks to Pat for tagging me. And until next Tag Tuesday, bye.